Previously on Let's Psychology.
Okie dokie, now it's time for your job, and your job is to complete the second Gert Big table that I've uploaded onto Teams for you. But I'm not going to ask you to do it all. I am going to ask you to do all of the first 4 columns. But the 5th column, the example of a study which provides both sides for debate, is a bit trickier, particularly given that we're only halfway through the course. So once you've done your work, come back to me and I'll go through some studies that I think represent a bit of one and a bit of another. So, a study that represents both nature and nurture. Well, I've got a couple for you actually. I don't know if you had any thoughts about this, but how about Bandura? Because the different genders had different amounts of aggression. He, in his introduction, actually said that perhaps that's because the kids had been rewarded for gender-appropriate behaviour in the past, so he wasn't going down the genetics route, but it's an argument that we can make. How about Casey? There was a difference in the go, no-go behaviour, whether they were hot tasks or cold tasks, and whether they're high or low delayers. So the nature of the task, the nature of the environment, influence the behaviour of the individuals. So free will determinism, for free will, by the way, I personally would have gone Bocchiaro and the 8% of whistleblowers, which leaves us free to throw in Milgram and the 35% of people that didn't give 450 volt electric shocks. They exercised their free will despite all the environmental pressures, and then there's the 65% that did, showing that those people didn't exercise their free will. That's not that big a split when you think about it. It's not like 52-48, is it? Therefore, there was a bit of both going on there in those results. In terms of individual and situational, well, again, you can say the exact same thing that we did with our chum Milgram, that the situation caused them to obey, but the individuals chose not to obey. But I'm going to be a little bit cheaty here as well and tell you that our new studies, they look at different cultures. And for instance, Kang Lee and his friends looked at the difference in lying and views of lying between Chinese and Canadian children. And they found that they start off very similar in their beliefs about lying, which is perhaps individual. But as they get older, the Chinese children change their approach to pro-social lying, i.e. lying in order to not get the glory for something, more thinking that's a good thing, whereas the Canadian children don't. So that starts off being individual, that they all do the same thing, but then the situation of the culture they're in changes their behaviour. A study for usefulness then? Well, once again, and this is getting a bit Milgram-tastic, but why not Milgram? We do have a use for it in that we can help ensure people in positions of responsibility do not blindly follow orders but are responsible for their behaviour. There's a story that James Blunt, everybody's favourite beautiful singer, was in charge of tanks in war-torn Kosovo and was ordered by the United Nations General to, if necessary by force, seize the airport from the Russian troops that were also involved in the peacekeeping, and that he refused for about 10 minutes before his personal major gave him some support, his colonel rather, major, colonel, whatever, and later famously said that he didn't want his troops to be responsible for starting World War III. So James Blunt, everybody's favourite beautiful pop singer, refused to follow orders because he took his personal responsibility. But it's very difficult to implement that. So perhaps an easier one is Cheney. We have short-term evidence that it changed people's behaviour, but no long-term evidence. And if it doesn't change anybody's behaviour long-term, then it's dubiously useful. A study that is both ethical and isn't ethical, well, lots of them are partially ethical, but I'm sorry to be boring, but the daddy of them all when it comes to ethics, once again, is Big Stanley Milgram, isn't it? He did cause them harm and stress in that they had, seizures and nervous laughter and pressing their fingertips into their palms and all that. But he fully debriefed them, and they had psychiatrists back up, etc., showing they hadn't had any long-term damage. He did say, the experimenter said, you must continue, but prior to that, they were told that their money was safe whatever happened, so they knew they could withdraw without loss. So while he did bad things, he also helped make up for it. Social sensitivity, I'd be interested to see what you thought was and wasn't socially sensitive, because I've got to tell you, when I start thinking about it, it's quite difficult to think of a study that isn't going to upset or be uncomfortable to some people somewhere, not just individuals, that's only ethics. Social sensitivity can be considered in terms of ethics, but ethics can't be considered in terms of social sensitivity, by the way. It's a bit like all thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs. Right, what I might have said for is socially sensitive, how about Bandura? If people are aggressive, it kind of suggests they've had that in their environment, so there's an issue of blaming parents, blaming the environment. Isn't, how about Sperry? You might argue that it makes people that have had split brain operations feel uncomfortable with the thought that they have a stream of consciousness that they're not consciously aware of and that they're kind of trapped. But on the other hand, we know that those effects hardly ever happen outside of lab conditions, so they're not really an issue. And once again, I'm going to cheat here and say one for both that you'll be meeting quite soon is a study by somebody called Gould, who was looking at the work on IQ done by somebody called Yerkes. Now, Yerkes did IQ tests on recruits into the American Army in the First World War, and he then, afterwards, broke those down into results by race and said that different races had different IQs. That's socially sensitive. That can be used in order to be prejudiced against people and say some races are more intelligent or less intelligent than others. On the other hand, what Gould did was break down the actual nature of the IQ testing and the IQ tests and showed that they were culture specific and they had been influenced by culture, thereby debunking that dodgy science that was surrounded by Yerkes and unsocially sensitizing it. So Gould good, Yerkes bad. It's kind of the same study. You'll understand it more when we get there. And as for a study that is a bit scientific and isn't a bit scientific all at the same time, well, how about a quasi-experiment or a field experiment? You've got plenty to choose from. You decide. So that's that column done. Whew, you must be exhausted. Have a cup of tea, right? Then come back, then have a bash at the last 4 columns, and then, my pedigree chums, I'll see what I can do to help you out on them. In a bit. So, strength of the nature debate then, team. Well, nature can basically be considered to be biology, so any biological application would be a strength. And of course, it's scientific, which means that it's more objective, more valid. That can also be a strength. Pick any biological study you like and pop it in as your example. Weakness, lack of ecological validity. It uses flashy kit that's time consuming, so it tends to have smaller samples, so perhaps difficult to generalize there. Fairly straightforward, I'd like to think. So nurture, well, again, nurture can pretty much be replaced with the words behaviourism. So Cheney or Bandura, any applications of them, the watershed, improving adherence, that's a strength. Weakness, again, it's pretty scientific, so losing ecological validity. And it's fair to say for both of them, weakness-wise, they're both pretty deterministic, which means that it's quite negative view of human nature, that we don't have any free will, we don't have any choice in what we do, and we like to think that we do. As for your answer for reductionism, well, reductionism, 1IV, a DV, cause and effect, science, I refer you to what we just said about nature. As for holism, well, it's difficult to do, so truly holistic study is very rarely done. You're looking at more variables, so it's hard to draw a conclusion. Freud, you might say, is a bit holistic because he looked at lots and lots of things that were going on in little Hans's life, but there's so much information there, it's difficult to say what's important and what's not. And demonstrates another weakness with the holistic approach is that when you're looking at everything, it's difficult to quantify any one thing, so it tends to become a bit more subjective. As for free will, well, it's a positive view of human nature, isn't it? It's the idea that we can change, that we're not trapped by our genes and our situations. Milgram showed that we don't have to take part in genocide. If we are ever unlucky enough to be in such a position where that might be a thing that we are being put under pressure to do, we can say no. When we look at helping behaviour, we'll learn that one person helping leads to other people's helping, so we can be aware that exercising free will often leads to other people exercising their free will as well. So there's the strengths of it. Weaknesses of it is that it means that life is entirely unpredictable and there's not much free will. Most studies kind of showed that things influence behaviour, though there are individual differences within that, so they don't show it 100%. As for determinism, well, it has applications. You know, if we say the environment that we learn something, how similar that is to the environment that we recall it, is a deterministic factor in memory, then Grant says that we should learn things in silence when we have to recall them in silence. There's an application, there's a strength. Although, of course, deterministic doesn't take into account individual differences, those people that don't fit in with the majority, and it also takes away the ability to take responsibility for your actions. You know, look at Casey. Oh, I couldn't help it. My ventral striatum made me do it. Well, it's an argument, I suppose, but does everybody with your ventral striatum behave like that? And if they don't, then maybe it's not just deterministic as you thought. Good things about individual explanations. Well, any explanation that was due to something within the person, i.e. their biology or their thinking patterns, is an individual. So any applications from any biological or cognitive approach is a strength of that debate. You got your eyewitness testimony and the fact that we can't really trust it because memory complex events is made up of information you perceived at the time and information that you got afterwards, and those are put together when recalling an event, which can lead to inaccurate or wrong memories. Furthermore, if an individual explanation is biological, that's associated with science, and all the strengths and weaknesses of the scientific approach to studying people are applicable there, as are all the studies that take that approach. Again, look at Casey. How much can we really learn about people from what their brains are doing while they are in a PET scanner? Well, perhaps their brains don't work the same way, so we're limited as to what we can do with science. As for situational, well, anything that surrounds us and influences our behaviour that we've learned, for instance, the presence of a role model, to change behaviour can be an application, so that's helpful. Again, if we're saying that behaviour is due to the environment or due to something inside us, that tends to be quite deterministic, which is quite negative. So there's like, a bit of strength, a bit of weakness. It's the usefulness debate. What the heck is useful about useful research? Well, how about the applications from it? Obviously, come on, keep up. But what's useful about unuseful research or research that has faults? Well, not misapplying the findings. If it turns out that Cheney's research, if it were to be studied long term, turned out not to be helpful, then we don't have to waste a load of time and money sticking bells and whistles on inhalers that don't have any long-term effects. Yeah. Okay. Why should we do ethical research? Because we have a responsibility to our participants. We have a duty of care to them. If we don't meet that duty, we may harm them. They may not come back for future research, so we lose our participant base. And as I said earlier, the subject may consider to be some sort of like, practical joke rather than an actual scientific research. So that's why we should be ethical. If we are too ethical, though, with the possible exception of some biological studies, we cannot get informed consent. So if we fully inform people what we're trying to find out, then they will either try to help the experiment unconsciously or possibly go the other way. Massive experimental effects, meaning that the results aren't valid and we don't find out anything. So that's why we should do ethical research. As an example of very ethical research, maybe one coming up, Maguire, who just basically photographed hippocampuses. It's not really going to change people's behaviour. And unethical research were our old friends, the social studies, deception, withdrawal, harm, all those things being done, but in enough interesting and we find stuff out. And so you'll be pleased to know our final point today. What is good and bad about scientific research? We save the easiest one till last. You know this. Science, one variable influences another variable, high levels of control, cause and effect, objective measurements, not influenced by bias or opinion, trustworthy, reliable, any scientific study. Look at your cognitive ones, they're quite good. The biological ones, apparently, really when you think about it, tend to be quasi-experiments, so they're kind of a little bit scientific but a little bit not scientific as well in terms of being able to control the participants. Any scientific experiment that has an application is useful. On the other hand, they all lack ecological validity. Look at Loftus and Palmer. Can we really find out about how memory is influenced with something like a car crash just by questioning people after they'd watched some sort of safety videos of cars crashing? It's not the same, is it? They're not in the car, they're not walking down the street, they don't have their earphones in, they're not paying attention, they don't get involved, all those things. So, the results will probably be different in the real world, and we can never judge to what effect that helps us to see what can and can't be found from there. So while I try and untangle myself from that last sentence, when we've done all that, we have fully prepared for section B. We will move on to section C next time. I may set you a couple of questions I've yet to decide. Have a good day. Bye for now.